Hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth and last seminar in the 2026 series of London Digital Classicist. Welcome everybody watching live and on YouTube, and anyone who will watch in the future as well, and to everybody here in the room. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jesse Obert, Assistant Professor at the University of South Florida, who is joining us in person. Jesse Obert is researching for his monograph project on warfare in archaic and classical periods in Greece and Crete through the social, economic, and political lens. And today he will demonstrate the digital practices involved in his research. If you're watching us online, feel free to say where you're watching from and ask any questions in the chat. And I'll leave now the word to Jesse, who will present Warriors Without War on Archaic Crete, testing paradigms and with big data and social network analysis.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you everybody for being here. It's fantastic to be back. I did my master's here a very long time ago at UCL. So this is kind of surreal to be in Senate House and talking about my work all these years later. So today I'm going to be presenting basically the introduction to my monograph, in which I tackle some big questions about the state of the field when it comes to the question of archaic Crete. We'll be looking at some social network analysis visualizations. We'll be looking at some of the results that I'm getting at, and then I'll sort of plug my book at the end, because my publishers would hate me if I didn't do something like that in a platform like this. All right. First, I always like to start with a thank you. So I was able to go and look at all of the armor from Crete that is currently on display at museums around the world, and that was made possible through funding from the American School of Classical Studies, the British School in Athens, various museums, Harvard Art Museums, a museum in Hamburg, as well as the Greek state. Unfortunately, quite a bit of that material has no provenance, and we know in several cases that it was actually looted, and there are people currently in prison serving prison sentences for that material that is currently on display in museums. So I've just put a red box around those objects, like the one in the upper right here, just to sort of acknowledge this more touchy material history, more recent history. So the problem of Greek cultural heritage remains an ongoing issue, and my hope is that acknowledging this history will drive that conversation towards a more equitable solution. So today we're going to be talking about the island of Crete. It is the largest island in the Aegean. It is the southernmost island in the Aegean. Well, it's not the southernmost, but it's almost the southernmost island in the Aegean. It's, I think, the third largest island in the Mediterranean. It really sits at the crossways in terms of trade and ideas in the ancient world between the west and the east. There's a major trade route going along the northern coast, and a major going east, and a major trade route going west along the southern coast. And then there's a very important trade route between southern Peloponnese and Kythera and northeastern Libya throughout the ancient period. Whenever I talk about Crete, I like to show a satellite image of the island, because it's at the bottom of the European tectonic plate. So it's coming up and above Africa, and you can see that in the sort of way in which the satellite imagery is preserved the seabed. So Crete is an island, as I said. It's actually one of the most mountainous regions in the Europe and in the Mediterranean, because it's coming up and moving upwards. So the south coast is also just one of the steepest and most immediate drops in the Mediterranean. So there's not really much human occupation along the south coast. The exception is the Mercenaries, where Gorton and several other important polis or city-states were. As you can see, it's facing west. Otherwise, Crete is occupied along the northern coast, and they're really looking towards the Greek world. And for reference, it's about the length of here to Birmingham. So whatever that means to you. Doesn't really mean much to me. So the material culture of Crete is very robust. People have written about it for a very long time. It famously is the origin of the Minoan culture. I just wrote a chapter on a handbook on Minoan stuff, and they're actually telling me not to use that word anymore. So whatever material culture you want to say for the late Bronze Age, it's coming out of Crete. It's very important. In the early Iron Age, the Cretans move away from the coastlines and up into the hills. They're still importing and exporting huge amounts of material from Eastern Mediterranean and Central Mediterranean, so they're very much interconnected to the whole Mediterranean world. We then enter a period called the Long Archaic period. This is going to be the focus of the talk, and what I'll be touching on later. And when we emerge out of that period, we're in the Hellenistic period, and Crete is very much part of the Greek world in this phase. This plaque on the right here is from the Temple of Zeus at Knossos, and it's depicting Heracles completing one of his famous 12 labors. It's the Erymanthian Boar. And so the Cretans are very much Greek in terms of their religion, their culture, everything else in the Hellenistic period. Now, this narrative is very much oriented around the site of Knossos, where, of course, the British School has been excavating for many decades, many decades. And it's really the site of Knossos that has dictated why we call this period in the middle the Long Archaic period. And Nicholas Coldstream famously coined this the Archaic Gap in the 20th century. So we really don't know where Knossos is as a site from the late 8th century to the beginning of the 3rd century. And we'll see there's some challenge to this idea, but for the longest time, they really thought that it basically didn't exist, that the Cretans were in isolation and they were basically practicing austerity, and there was no occupation at the site. This, what do you do if you're a historian or an archaeologist and you need to know about a place that doesn't exist archaeologically? You turn to literary sources, right? So this has led people to really dig into the literary sources for Crete when they're trying to understand the island. The Cretans appear in the Iliad, in book 24, Patroclus's funeral games. It's a Cretan who wins the archery contest. In the Odyssey, Odysseus claims to be from Crete when he's lying to people. When he lies to Athena, when he arrives at Ithaca, he claims to be from Crete. And there's a nod to this in the movie. If you've seen it, they say just pretend to be a Cretan. So little sneak peek that I actually enjoyed, but I think everybody else didn't understand. In Plato's Laws, the Cretans are a main character. So the Laws is Plato's last great dialogue. A lot of scholars have not given it much attention because it actually goes against a lot of his ideas in the Republic. So it's sort of the last final thing, very utilitarian view of political theory rather than a sort of more cerebral intellectual. But it's set on the island of Crete, and the three protagonists, one is an Athenian, one is a Lacedaemonian, and the other is a Cretan, and they're discussing what makes good law. So this is another way that scholars have turned to try to understand the island. Then there's Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle treats the Cretan constitution, what he says, as an archetype of aristocratic government. This is very important to him because otherwise the Cretans don't fit in his taxonomies of what government is. And so he needs to they're kind of like the exception that proves the rule. So he needs to really fit them somewhere in his system in order to make sense of them. And then we have a whole bunch of fragments of other. Strabo preserves a little bit of Ephorus, who wrote quite a bit, we think, about the Cretans and their culture in the classical and earlier periods. But really, it's all much later fragments that we just have to piece together. For my work, it's really important. There's 5 additional things that no one really talks about that are really important. The Cretans were actually directly involved in the Peloponnesian War and the Corinthian War, and they're described to us by Thucydides and Xenophon in these conflicts. They're also in the March of the 10,000. Xenophon spends quite a bit of time talking about them. Fascinatingly, they're called archers, but in the Anabasis, Xenophon talks about how they could practice firing their bows back at the Persians, because it's not something that they're particularly practiced at, know how to do. These are going to be pivotal for me at the end of the talk, and then in my book, I talk about that there's a whole chapter basically dedicated to these 5 references and how we should make sense of them. But for early scholars, in their mind, these were just all instances of mercenarianism, and they're always cited, these 5 are cited as examples of Cretans being mercenaries. The problem with that is that there's only number 3, the March of the 10,000 is them being mercenaries, and also the Spartans and the Athenians and the Thebans are mercenaries in that episode. All the other instances are not, there's no mention of them being mercenaries. They're described as sumachoi, or allies to the Spartans in the Corinthian War. And in the Sicilian expedition, Thucydides is listing everyone involved in the expedition, the Athenians, and he says, here are the Mystophora, the mercenaries, and then he says, here are the people who only showed up because the Athenians were paying a wage. And there's where he lists the Cretans. So they are interested in money, which will be important later in the talk, but they're not actually described as mercenaries. And yet, the first major source to talk about Crete and Cretan politics and Cretan warriorhood was G.T. Griffith in 1935, and he describes it as an island of mercenaries. And his justification is predominantly piracy, that later periods, the Cretans were practiced pirates. And then he cites these references that don't actually, in the Greek, name them mercenaries. So I have a sort of side theory about this. So 1935 is really important for Greek politics. Eleftheros Venizelos, the important father of Greek democracy, modern Greek democracy, his supporters attempted their second coup against the government in 1935, in March of 1935. It was a failure, and Venizelos had to go into exile. But then in October, there was counter coup in which the Greek state was dissolved and the dictatorship took over. And so I've always wondered if G.T. Griffith was taught, and Venizelos is Cretan, I should say. He's an important Cretan politician. And so I've always wondered if G.T. Griffith was thinking about Crete as an island of mercenaries. Maybe he was reading the newspaper and thinking about Venizelos and maybe thinking a little bit too hard about mercenarism and violence on Crete. But this is essentially the origin of this narrative about Cretans being mercenaries and violent. In 1955, R.F. Willits took some inscriptions and Aristotle in particular and wrote multiple books, but the one that's important for us is the Aristocratic Society in Ancient Crete. He argued that the Cretans essentially had an ethno-nationalist state in which a small minority of Central Greek Dorian peoples were ruling over the Minoan peoples that were living on the island, the indigenous Minoan peoples that were living on the island. And so he really sort of digged into Aristotle's archetypal system of government in order to sort of justify it based on the inscriptions that he was aware of and that he was publishing. I then point to Victor Davis Hanson's Western Way of War. He doesn't really have anything substantive to say about Cretans. It's only a couple sentences, but this ends up being something cited very frequently by Cretan scholars studying Crete ever after. He describes the island as a peripheral space. He calls it an outlands of the Greek world in which they practice ritualized warfare, so a highly religious, systematic style of violence. This all led to 1999. Angelos Chaniotis is from Minoan farmers to Roman traders. And Chaniotis is really committed to Willits and Victor Davis Hanson's narrative, and he cites them all the time. And he argues that the adequate economic system for such a social organization, namely sort of peripheral ritualized warfare space with ethno-nationalist aristocratic hierarchies, was a subsistence economy based on farming and animal husbandry. So my contention with this work is that he has taken this conclusion that there are these aristocratic systems, and he's gone and found evidence for it. So he's really he's done the reverse of what I think a good historian should do. No shade to Angelos Chaniotis. He and I get along great, but this is my problem with this work, and this is one of the reasons that I delved into this project. So I should say that this narrative has faced a lot of scrutiny lately. The excavators at Knossos have, in collaboration with Grace Ernie at Berkeley, have reassessed all the pottery chronologies and now have found an archaic and classical Knossos. They haven't found any of the buildings, but they are confident that there exists an archaic and classical Knossos. It was just as important as it was in earlier periods. It was either destroyed by Arthur Evans when he was looking for Minoan stuff all those years ago, or it's underneath the modern city of Knossos. And so when they were building the hospital just up the road, they found a ton of burials that are probably archaic. And so I've always thought that it's somewhere north of the hospital up here, and it's just underneath the modern city. So we won't find it anytime soon, but it exists. And so all of this stuff about the sort of austerity and people sort of uninhabitation of Crete, we now need to reassess. There's a great body of work by Michael Gagarin and Paul Perlman, where they just assembled all of the legal inscriptions for Crete. So there are more inscriptions, legal inscriptions from Crete than anywhere else in the Greek world except Athens. They're number 2. So we know quite a bit about their legal systems. They're very diverse, for one thing, and there's really no such thing as a sort of Cretan constitution. They are radically different across the island. So Aristotle, say what you will. But this has now all been published in English, and so you can go and check out that book. It's very great and really has changed how we think about politics in archaic Crete. And then there's ongoing excavations. So the Italians have just published a new Prineus volume in 2023, and they've completely changed the narrative about site occupation and agricultural intensity, these sorts of things. I highly recommend this book. It's very fascinating. We'll talk a little bit about some of their theories later on. Finally, one of the most exciting things that has happened lately is that in 2017, a team of Libyan and Syrian archaeologists determined that this pottery typology that they found all over the Levant, all over Cyprus, and all over Egypt, which they've just been calling Greek ware or Ionian ware for the last 100 years, turns out it's all coming from Crete. They did neutron activation analysis. It's all coming from the Meseret. It's all coming from Gortyn. And interestingly, the Gortynians are not consuming it very much themselves. So this is an export economy. They are exporting in mass. We don't know what. We don't know what's in these pots. We don't know how they're using these pots. They seem to be sort of more luxury objects that are being, in Syria, they're using them for burials. So there's something happening. It's happening in the beginning of the 5th century, and it really dominates the Cretan economy, it looks like, for the rest of the classical and into the Hellenistic period. So, so much for subsistence economies. And really, this is the beginning of when I started going into this project during my PhD. I was trying to figure out, well, what about the warrior aristocracies? What about that whole narrative? What can we say about it? So there has been some work on this, and I just need to sort of address this. Unfortunately, I adore James Whitley and David Lewis, but unfortunately, I disagree strongly with their conclusions. In 2009, James Whitley said that there were no hoplites on the island because no bronze shield has been traced to Crete. This is unfortunately just inaccurate and incorrect. There are more shields from Crete than anywhere else in the Greek world except for Olympia. So again, they're number 2, but they're still very prevalent. We have a ton of shields from Crete. David Lewis recently, in an article called The Cretan Way of War, riffing off of Victor Davis Hansen, made the argument that they have Homeric style of warfare from the 8th to the 2nd century. And this is, I think, very interesting and very, very valuable, but he was predominantly looking at the narrative that the Cretans were doing in their own inscriptions in the Hellenistic period. And so clearly they had this idea that they should be thought of as Homeric warriors in the Hellenistic period. But unfortunately, David doesn't actually cite anything. Well, he only cites a couple things here and there from the Archaic and Classical periods. He hasn't really delved into the evidence. And to his credit, the evidence, there's a ton of stuff. It's published in a bunch of different languages, and it's never been collated in any sort of substantive way. It's just a ton of data that took me about 3 years to put all together. And I have lots of evidence for violence. So here's a map of Crete. Here are all the sites that have evidence of violence. Crete was never unified politically. So these are all, the red dots are all probably independent city-states. They are what we qualify as urban space or the polis. Many of these are not known in literature or in our historical sources. So whether or not they're a polis is kind of an open question. That word is a Greek word, the way that they describe their own cities. So we don't know if they would have qualified, but for our purposes, we're sort of bunching them all together. There's an example of one on the left. This is Azoria out on the eastern part of the island. It's been excavated very heavily by the Americans. It is very much an urban space. It's an urban dwelling, civil settlement oriented around a acropolis. Not attested in any literature, so we have no idea if it's a polis, but it looks like one. The blue triangles are extra-urban sanctuaries. These are temporary festival spaces. There's no permanent infrastructure at these sites. They're typically high in the mountains or in cave sanctuaries, but they're being used for seasonal festivals. And we have a ton of dedications to these spaces. So the Cave of Ida is just filled with dedications, predominantly high value gold, silver, and very intricate bronze objects. So these are interesting spaces where people are coming for annual festivals. Palikastro and Komos are in the ruins of old Minoan towns. So they've repurposed old Minoan ruins for a similar sort of assemblage where they're doing these sort of rituals and seasonal festivals where they're going on pilgrimage to these spaces. These are the types of evidence that we have. We have armor, of course, but we also have arrows and weapons and bows. We also have buildings like walls and fortification buildings. We have coins, we have inscriptions, we have plaques, we have painted pottery, we have texts, we have, you name it, we've got a lot of stuff. The largest amount of things that we have are votive miniatures. The Cretans really like miniature figurines, miniature shields, helmets, weapons, and these are all over the island. Okay, so what I did is I created a massive database in which I collected all of the evidence. This is available online as a CSV, a comma segmented values data set. I presented it here as a FileMaker just because I think it looks prettier. But this is a sort of standard big data, legacy data database. The images are not available online because many of these are my own images because I did go and look at all of the armor in person. I was able to do autopsies of all of it. So the descriptions have my personal autopsies. There's bibliography, in case you're interested in looking this up, and then a lot of metadata, chronological data. It's all based on what has been published. So this is what people say about this piece, where it is, its Pleiades ID, where it is now, because many of them are not where they started. And then sort of the important bit for us and for this talk are the tags. So I created a Boolean system, a yes, no, true, false system, where I just took every piece of evidence and I asked, does this support someone's narrative about ancient warfare? And each of these tags corresponds to a body of scholarship that people have sort of created a definition. And my dissertation has a whole chapter dedicated to defining each of these. So working class versus leisure class hoplites, this comes from Hans's 2004 book about the sort of different makeup of a classical Athenian army. 50% were working class, 50% were leisure class. Leisure class being individuals who are putting a lot of time and money into looking really good on the battlefield. So they're investing in high quality equipment, they're looking flashy. This is a corselet that is beautifully decorated. It's got some very intricate designs, kind of hard to see in the slide, but there's 2 chariots on either rib with warriors on either side. So this checks the box. Yes, this is supporting that argument that there is a leisure class hoplite on Crete. Then you just go through and you do the rest of them. And I have a confidence coefficient associated with it based on my confidence that this piece of evidence is supporting that narrative. Is attendance. I had a whole thing about attendance. There's a bunch of people carrying spears on this shield or on this corselet. Yes, it does. It could work for that argument. I'm not super confident about it. Only 1 out of 3. Mounted hoplites. This is Peter Greenhall's argument about chariots and their use. They're on either rib. Does it satisfy that argument? Yes. Am I confident? Well, only 2 out of 3, right? So it's just a Boolean system. This is, of course, extremely biased, but you can't make a database without having your own bias. So I did all this, and this allowed me to do social network analysis. So this is scary, but we'll talk through it. So let's just imagine for a moment that we only have 3 pieces of evidence. We have this plaque, or applique rather, that's currently in the Louvre, depicting 2 individuals, one carrying a bow. We have Xenophon's Anabasis, and then we have this helmet currently in the Met that is very beautifully decorated. This depicts an individual with a bow. Xenophon's Anabasis, as I said, describes Cretans using bows and arrows. This is both evidence for archery. They are connected by a line, or an edge is what we call it. This helmet is very beautiful. Leisure class hoplites, something that somebody wanted to show off how they look. The Xenophon's Anabasis describes how the Cretans are decked out in bronze. They're sort of weighed down by their bronze, and they use their bronze at one scene to sort of distract the enemy. So leisure class hoplites in both cases, they get a line. Now there's nothing, this doesn't have any archery, and this doesn't have any leisure class hoplites. So these 2 nodes are not connected in any way. They don't have any commonality in terms of evidence that they're showing for. So you spin all of this visualization around, you end up with a line because centrifugal force. The thing about social network analysis is orientation doesn't matter. So you can either be a horizontal line or a vertical line. It doesn't matter which way up is. It's whatever you want it to be. What happens is that you form these clusters around various types of evidence for warfare. So you have this really big archery bubble, or what we cluster is what we call them. You have this really big leisure class hoplites cluster. You have large round shields, and you have own-flow shields that are really just segregating into their own thing. You have a little bit of cavalry, but it's kind of just up there doing its own thing. So I'm a big Gregory and Geddes digital humanist. So there's a book in 2014 in which they argue that you should never use digital humanities tools to answer a question. It's not a conclusion creating device. It's a thesis creating device. So you should create these visualizations, and then you should start asking questions. And it's from those questions that you then go and do more traditional historical research. Because there's just so much bias in me creating this. This is entirely dependent on how I created my database. So I just started asking questions. And the first big question I had is, what are these 5 things in the middle? What are these? They're sort of holding the whole visualization together. What are they, and what are they doing? Well, so the 2 darker ones are identical shields depicting a lion hunt in which there are warriors fighting as hoplites and there are warriors fighting as archers. So we have leisure class hoplite and archery, and the medium itself is a leisure class hoplite. It's a very beautiful shield, very heavily decorated. Then we have Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and as I talked about, those are very diverse in the way that they were describing Cretans and Cretan warriors. Then we have Xenophon's Anabasis, which again is very diverse. It's just describing a little bit of archery, a little bit of leisure class hoplites, and a little bit of everything. So they're holding everything together just because they're describing everything and the way that visualization works. So the next question I had was, why are such expensive forms of violence so prominent? Archery takes a lot of time to practice and be good at. The arrowheads that we have are the so-called Cretan typology, which was probably made with the lost wax technique. So these are expensive arrowheads that are sort of luxury object. And there's a lot of them. As you can see, the arrowheads make up the majority of that bubble. And then leisure class hoplites. Where are the working class? Where are the non-wealthy people? Where are the poor combatants? Where are the enslaved? We have enslaved people in ancient combat all the time. Where are all these people? And this led me to a really interesting series of conclusions. So we have a lot of evidence for violence on the island of Crete, but we have no evidence for warfare. And what I mean by that is that we have no fortification walls in this period. So we have lots of fortification walls in the late Minoan period, lots of fortification walls in the early Iron Age that are all repurposed and sort of recycled at the beginning of the Archaic period. And there are no fortification walls, as far as we can tell, for this period. And then they are rebuilt in the Hellenistic period. So this just happens to be a period in which none of the sites have fortification walls. There are no clear destructions related to violence in this period. Only Azoria and Prinias are abandoned. The new narrative for Prinias is that it was a famine that drove them out in the mid-6th century, and they relocated to another site nearby that had better access to agriculture. And the word on the street, what I've heard is that Donald Haggis at Azoria is now reframing this site as a sort of intentional relocation, maybe a synarchismos, where people are relocating to form a new community somewhere else. No evidence of destruction related to, I mean, there are destructions, absolutely, but they're mostly accidental fires and things like that, nothing related to war. And this is especially obvious when we look at a site like Aptera, which in the Hellenistic period was besieged, and archaeologists found piles of arrows, piles of slings, dead bodies with weapons in them. So we have a very clear example of a destruction layer related to warfare. Nothing like that for the Archaic and Classical periods. We only know of 2 violent episodes in our historical sources for Crete in this period. So in 429, this is already on one of the slides, but I'll mention it again. 429, the Athenians invade Kydonia during the Architanian War, the first half of the Peloponnesian War. Essentially what happens is a single Gortinian goes to Athens and says, let me borrow your army for a summer. And for some reason they say yes in the height of the Peloponnesian War. And so they go and raid Kydonia. And Thucydides doesn't know what to do with this because they don't attack the city, they just go and raid some farms. So this is an episode of violence, but there's no Cretan warriors, there's no sort of pitched combat, there's nothing like that. It's just a sort of an episode of violence that we have that Thucydides doesn't seem to know what to do with. And then in 346, according to Diodorus, we have a war between Knossos and Lyctos. There was a bunch of mercenaries milling about on the mainland who had just been involved in one of the sacred wars, and the Cnossians hired them to attack the Lyctians. They go and they attack Lyctos, and the Lyctians go to the Spartans and say, hey, Sparta, come save us. And so the Spartans send an army to fight the mercenaries. So there's a war between Lyctos and Knossos in 346, and neither of them seem to have an army, and neither of them have any warriors themselves. They have to depend on foreign warriors and foreign combatants in this conflict. And then finally, I always want to mention this, the low levels of violence on the island. So I was talking to Hans about this earlier. The perimortem and antemortem trauma on the island in our skeletal records for the island of Crete in these periods is at 7%. Now, any bone archaeologists will tell you that that probably means that there was a mistake made in the data collection process, because 10 is the minimum. There's no way it could ever be 7. The modern population of Crete has an average antemortem and perimortem trauma of 44%. So it's just insanely unlikely that the Archaic and Classical Cretans have only 7% trauma. This is like both trauma at any stage in their life. And so there's extremely low levels of trauma on the island of Crete. It's probably a mistake somebody made in the data collection, but certainly you can't make an argument that the island was full of warriors and combatants at this stage. So what do I think is going on here? This is borrowing from Kate Anderson's work. I think that we have a lot of evidence for warriors and no evidence for combatants. And what do I mean by that? A combatant is someone that she defines who experiences combat. And there are a lot of people who experience combat who can't be a warrior, because being a warrior means that you're embracing and presenting that experience as your identity. So, for example, enslaved people, women in a lot of cultures, they can be involved in combat and they can fight, but then because of the social norms of their community, they cannot go into the assembly and say, I'm a warrior, due to the constraints over gender and things like that. So what we're looking at, I think, is a huge amount of evidence for people who are claiming identity, claiming violence and combat, the experience of combat as their identity, and basically no evidence for people who actually might have experienced combat. So this seems to suggest that they're curating how they're preserving the material that they're dedicating to temples and how they're presenting warriorhood on the island in the Archaic and Classical periods. And that leads me to the next big question that I had for this data set, which was about place. Does place matter? So here's a GIS social network analysis visualization. Another, this is even scarier than the last one and messier and gross, I'm sorry. But essentially what's going on here is each of the points is now a place that has evidence for violence. The lines connecting them indicate similarity of assemblage when it comes to evidence for violence. So a very big, fat, dark red line means that their assemblages are basically the same. And a very thin line means that there are only a couple of typologies of evidence that are similar. No line connecting them means that there's none of the types of evidence are the same at those two sites. The final metric that I've added into this is called the betweenness centrality. This is a measure of how often a node, a place, appears on the shortest path between two distinct nodes in the data set. So let's just strip this down and imagine we have 4 places: Kydonia, Eleutherna, Knossos, and Komos. So if you are going to get from Kydonia to Eleutherna, you don't have to jump over any other places. Just the direct line, just go straight there. If you're going to go from Kydonia to Komos, though, you got to jump through Eleutherna. So Eleutherna gets 1 point. We're going from Kydonia to Knossos. You also have to go through Eleutherna. Now Eleutherna's got 2 points. So this is the betweenness centrality is just a sum of how many times a place is between 2 other places. And the software goes through and calculates all of the sums. And you get something like this with the nodes reflecting their size. So how big they are reflects how many times they're on a path between 2 sites. So my first big question was about Ida and Dikti, these 2 very prominent extra-urban sites here in the middle. Ida has the largest assemblage for the whole island by a lot, and yet its betweenness centrality is very small. So what I think this means is that the extra-urban sanctuaries are doing something. They're only connected to each other, and they're doing something unique. And we'll return to this when we start talking about my thoughts about the sort of conclusions about this analysis. The next big important thing is that Ephrati is the biggest. Now, why is this? Well, I'm pretty sure that this is just looting. So the helmet at the Met that we already looked at and a whole bunch of armor around the world was looted from Ephrati in the 1960s. It was then sold on the black market to a man named Norval Schimmel, who then died and bequeathed it to various museums around the world. Because he bequeathed it in his will, it does not qualify for repatriation. So it's the first thing you see when you enter the Met is an object that was looted. The person who looted it is currently in prison serving a sentence. He went when he was captured, and when they tracked him down and put him in prison, he told the Greek officials where he looted the material. He took them to Ephrati. They did emergency excavations, and they found a really major site. We don't know what it's called because Ephrati is the modern name, so we don't know what the ancient was. But this assemblage, once you look through all the stuff that came out of this looting episode, definitely did not come from Ephrati. This includes Hellenistic stuff. It includes Minoan material. So Ephrati is probably just the place that he said that he got everything. And now this is what's been published. Everything is said to be from Ephrati. So that's probably why this bubble is so big. It's because it's got all of this armor hoard that is just kind of a catch-all for looted material that is currently on display in museums. Then the next big 3 are Axos, Gorton, and Chrysos. And for me, the book is basically about Axos and Gorton. They're the protagonists of my book because Axos is doing this sort of bottom-up warriorhood thing that's really fascinating in some of my later chapters. And then Gorton is doing a sort of top-down thing that is really important for understanding of Cretan warfare in the classical period. Chrysos was the weird one out of left field, or whatever the idiom is. I did not expect to see a betweenness centrality so high. And this led me to a really, really interesting observation. So wall of text, don't bother reading it. I'll summarize what's going on here. In 2005, Mika Prent wrote a book called Cretan Sanctuaries and Cults, in which she just went through all the major sanctuaries and cults and assembled all the archaeological data. Many of these sites have been excavated since the 19th century, so this was a monumental Herculean task. And she noticed that the early excavations of Chrysos determined that Altar Hill, the main sanctuary at the middle of the community, was actually an extra-urban sanctuary for much of its history. It was being used by villages in the surrounding valleys. They were only using it temporarily, sort of for seasonal festivals. And then towards the end of the 7th century, through sort of intentional synoikismos, intentional establishment of a polis, they all relocated around Altar Hill, and it became an urban sanctuary. And what's so fascinating about this is the ways in which they depicted warriors changed when that happened. And so this is why Chrysos is so big, because it's connected to all the extra-urban sanctuaries and it's connected to all the urban sanctuaries. It has assemblages of both types of warrior. So in the late 8th century, the Chrysos warrior had an open-faced helmet. They were typically carrying lighter equipment like swords, and they had an omphalos-type shield. It's a one-handed shield with a boss. And then in the after 7th century, in the 6th century, warriors have the large round shield, the more traditional hoplite shield is strapped to their forearm. enclosed-faced helmets like the Corinthian type and body armor. And they usually have their shield behind them so you can see their body armor, which is important for the artists. And this also is attested in the social network analysis. If you segregate the data set based upon place or context, extra-urban sanctuaries have omphalos type shields and archery as the two major clusters. Urban spaces have large round shields and leisure class hoplites. There's also an archery cluster here that's just sort of floating along the periphery, not connected in any way to everything else. What this means is that every one piece of evidence for archery in an urban space is not evidence for any other type of warfare in the tag collection, in the data set collection. It only checked one thing, right? That's why it's just floating on its own. And so just as like a sort of pin, a footnote, I should say, I'm almost 100% certain at this point that all of this evidence is hunting, not war. We have no descriptions, or the only time we have a description of people using their bows against human beings in the Archaic and Classical period is Xenophon, when he says they have to practice to do it because they did not know how to do it otherwise. But we also have only 2 depictions of them in art shooting their bows at people, and they're both in the 9th century, so they're in early Iron Age. They're not Archaic and Classical. And the Cretan arrowhead is this really big, heavy hunting arrow. So this is almost certainly all archery related to warfare, related to hunting, not to warfare. Because of the way I built this database, there's no way for me to segregate between those types of violence. I just collected anything related to violence, and so I captured hunting, I think, and that's what's going on here. Okay, let's look closer at these assemblages. So in the extra-urban space, warriorhood is very much a collaborative thing. We have the shield in front of the torso in basically every case. So they're really like shields with heads and legs, which is quite interesting. They're working together. We have a lot of processual scenes. This is the only place that we have naval warfare depicted in any format, which is interesting because we're on an island, and the Cretans were famous for naval warfare later in the Hellenistic period. I think it's because it's collaborative. So they're only really depicting collaborative styles of violence in the extra-urban space. So naval warfare belongs in the extra-urban space. We have beautiful shields like this one. This is the lion hunt shield, one of the lion hunt shields that I referenced earlier. So it's maybe a little hard to make out in black and white, but there's a bunch of these warriors with shields literally replacing their torsos, and they're sort of in their final moments being eaten by a lion. We have a bunch of them all along the periphery. And for each one, there's an archer coming to save them. Well, not really, coming to avenge them, maybe. And also with a shield replacing their torso. And this is, a motif about us versus them, man versus nature. We have others of these types that are sphinxes rather than lions, so it's a sort of mythological other or natural other, not ever a human other. But this seems to be this sort of collaborative, like we're in this together sort of messaging that's going on related to violence and warriorhood in extra-urban spaces. And this is radically different than what we see in the urban space. So in the urban spaces, it's much more traditional hoplite. They are wearing enclosed-faced helmets, blocking their ability to hear. There's very much an interest in anatomy. They are covering themselves in bronze. They're wearing these groin guards dangling from the bottom of their, maybe from the bottom of both sides of their corselet, which reenactors tell me makes it difficult to run and move. So they're not really moving very much. They're not very mobile. They're sort of standing in place. They're looking really, really good though. And they're being very impressive. And they're writing their names on them, which is fascinating. And the verb they're using is a version of ireo, often with the apo preposition, meaning to take away. So this is war booty. We have a lot of evidence of lethal damage. This is all war booty. So they're writing their name on the things that they've captured from another warrior. This is about advertising your individual prowess, yelling in the face of everybody else saying, I'm the best. Anyone who's used to dedications will be weirded out by the fact that there's no god in any of these. They are just writing their name with the verb. So Charisthenes, the son of Pythias, took this one away. We have no idea if this is even a dedication, maybe just something on display. And oftentimes they don't even have a verb, just Visocartes this one, the Visocartes this one. So he just went through and he wrote his name on all of the pieces. Visocartes is the Cretan version of Isocrates. So he's just going through and labeling all the ones that he captured. And so what's so fascinating about these two distinct versions of warriorhood is they're contemporary. The helmet from Visocartes and the lion hunt shield are both 640 BCE, which is also the proposed date for the earliest law written on Crete and the earliest law written in Europe. So this is all happening at the same time, the emergence of the polis, in a very interesting way. And I do not think that they're separate things. I think that these are two sides of a single identity crafting thing. And you can see that in a very small collection in which they're hybridizing these ideas. So this is a grave stele from Prineus. It's an urban warrior. He's got an enclosed face helmet. He's got the corselet. But then we have this ring around his body, and you can see it's overlapping his shoulder and his knee. And I think that the artist has given us X-ray vision. And in fact, he would look like an extra-urban warrior if we couldn't see through his shield. And just to emphasize this point, the weapon is very important for the extra-urban warrior. They're always poking out. And in this hybridized version, you'll notice the rim goes over the shoulder, but then the spear goes over the rim. And it's sort of impossible to achieve perspective sort of thing. And so I think this is just about the artist trying to make us think this is both an urban and extra-urban warrior. We've got these two ideologies are operating together. So how do I deal with this? Well, I'm a disability theorist increasingly. So in disability theory, there's this concept called the normate, which is sort of the idea of normal that we project in our own cultural perspectives. So Rosemary Garland Thompson has this great definition of the term normate, and she says it's a term that usefully designates the social figure through which people can represent themselves as definitive human beings. Normate then is the constructed identity of those who, by way of their bodily configurations and cultural capital that they assume, can step into a position of authority and wield the power it grants them. So it's the normal that we're all trying to pretend we are, but no one actually is. And we're all sort of projecting ideas about what that means as a way to sort of reassure ourselves that we are normal. And so what I think is going on here is that the Cretans are going up to the extra-urban space and saying, we're normal because we are all working together against a common enemy. And then they're going into the urban space and they're saying, I'm normal because I captured this war booty from this other really fancy pants guy in combat. And look how great I am at being a warrior. And they have to balance these two seemingly different ideologies of violence in order to be a Cretan warrior, which is the normate version, the normal version of Cretan warriorhood. So what's really, really the added fun thing, and I'm probably running short on time, but I'm going to keep going for the last little bit. What's really, really fun about this is that both of these ideologies were extremely expensive. It took a lot of money to go up to these extra-urban spaces. Most of these dedications are in silver and gold in the extra-urban space. This is something that's very luxury, reserved for the people who don't need to work every day. And in the urban space, all this equipment is also very expensive, but then there's also this sort of utilitarian component where you actually have to be good at combat in order to do these things. So you got to train. You have to be a good combatant. And we can see, I think, this perfectly when we look at the one exception that proves the rule. So this is Temple A at Prineus. It has this depiction of all these warriors along the top. It's sitting right in the middle of the Agora. So this is an urban context. These warriors are extra-urban warriors. They are the shield in front of their bodies. They're otherwise lightly equipped. They're all processing together. So why is it that we have this extra-urban warrior in an urban context? They're all on horseback. So you could look at this and think, oh, we're all in this together if you can afford a horse. There's a buy-in level here that is unique to Prineus, and I think is really defining how these ideologies are working. So even when we see the extra-urban ideology in an urban context, buy-in and wealth are pivotal and required to being able to identify as that as a warrior in these spaces. So in the book, I make this, in the introduction, I make this idea that this is a sort of cyclical process. There's this drive to be normal, so you have to go to urban and extra-urban spaces in order to project this normalcy. You then have to commit time to training and combat. You have to be successful because you have to get war booty and power and wealth. This leads to political privileges and economic advantages and institutional support, which allows you to then go and participate in the extra-urban rituals and give war booty dedications, and these are displays or whatever you want to call them, and so on and so forth. And then by doing so, you are projecting a new level of normal and saying, I'm normal, I'm a warrior, and the cycle continues. In the sort of the body of the book, takes these ideologies and thinks about what they mean for gender identity and sort of the identity of the masculine character, because all of these figures, you may have noticed, don't have beards and don't have genitalia. So this is it's a cyborg. It's very much it's an intersex character that is being used as the sort of figure of warriorhood on Crete in the Archaic and Classical periods. When they start regulating violence on the island of Crete, they only regulate where war booty is coming into the community, and it looks like they're doing it in order to create credit and loan opportunities for local community members. So the polis is only really concerned about what warriors are doing in terms of how they can benefit the community in terms of credit and loans, which is fascinating. That's the next major chapter, looking at sort of the legal component of how this works. And as this type of violence proliferates throughout the rest of the Greek world, we see this institutional shock from other mainland communities, because now they have to deal with these small number of Cretans who are dedicated to committing violence and extremely wealthy, and not really collecting any of the war booty themselves. So in one of our legal inscriptions, it says that 100% of all war booty will be given to one particular temple for the purpose of loan redistribution. So the warriors have to go into it spending a lot of money and come out of it making no money. And this just, I think, shatters how Athenian and Spartan warfare is working in the classical periods. And as a response, we get the Theban sacred band. So this is, I think, how like even these institutions, the electoral institutions, are emerging as a response to the Cretans. And of course, the Theban sacred band was instrumental for Philip II, and Alexander took that professional military and conquered the known world. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Jesse, for the fascinating presentation. Are there any questions in the room or in the chat? In the meantime, I'll ask my first question. So I'm particularly interested in one of the last things you mentioned about institutionalization of the warriorhood and the relationship with the economy and the coins evidence, because following your social network analysis, there was a 2.53% of coins, I think. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
The Cretans are one of the earliest regions to start minting coins. They start in the late 6th century. So they're part of the Aeginetan trade network between North Africa and southern Greece. So they're on the Aeginetan standard, but they're like different poleis are doing different things when it comes to minting. And a lot of them are minting. So for one thing, overstrikes are really, really popular. So they'll take another polis's coin, and then they'll just put like some sort of symbol on it to be like, no, this is Gortinian. But the previous symbol is already there. So it's very clear that they're in active competition through minting and numismatics. And then they're also doing something which is really interesting, is that they're introducing a whole bunch of lower denominations that are at a lower standard. And so people think that they're not ever leaving the island because they're kind of useless outside of the island. So some communities are doing this sort of, I just proposed this as an abstract to the AIA because their deadline is August 3rd. But some communities are doing this sort of like fiscal repurposing, where they're trying to expand the use of coins within the community by introducing extremely low denominations. And then other communities are being very aggressive geopolitically by taking another, like a neighbor's coin, and then just restamping it so that you know that they're restamping someone else's coins. When it comes to warfare, we have a ton. This is, I think, all hunting. I think a ton of Cretans like to put the Cretan arrowhead typology, which is a very big, heavy arrowhead, or a bow on their coins. We never have any depictions of them being used. It's just like a bow or an arrow. So that's all of the coins in the database are just coins that have arrowheads on them.
We don't know if it's related to actually hunting or
no. Yeah, and this is saying to Hans is I want to do one of my next big projects will have to be arrowheads, because I really don't know there's some theories about how we can distinguish. Some of the arrowheads have wood still preserved in them, so maybe we could do some sort of analysis on the wood to figure out if they're using a heavier shaft or not. Unfortunately, we're at a stage where no one has really tried to tackle that question, as far as I know.
So I've got two questions. I don't know if it's fairer to ask them both now or to ask one and then let other people have a go.
Just up to you two.
Okay.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for a really exciting
Thank you.
Talk. And we hear the word digital humanities a lot, but it's very hard often to visualize, like, what can this actually do for our research? And so this was a really kind of eye-popping example, potentially. Firstly, could you just highlight for us where you think your use of big data and social network analysis was really critical to helping you towards your conclusions? I know you said it doesn't give you the conclusions, but obviously help you along the way. So if you could just sum that up for us who were busy writing notes, we hardly had time to think. My second question is, so my research, and I won't inflict the details of that on the room, it's painful enough for me, but there are lots of data points involved. There are lots of variables, and I could see myself like creating these sorts of variables, like whose theory does this agree with, etc. So, what would you say to someone in my position to help them decide whether it's actually worth their time, which none of us have a surplus of, to invest that time in building a database? Because I thought, yeah, maybe I should build a database, but at the same time, I don't know if I'm going to get much of a return on my investment, where it's just going to bring stuff to light which I was already aware of. So how do you what advice would you give to us to help us decide whether it's worth that?
Yeah, so actually your two questions, I kind of have the same answer for both of them. So I started this project in 2019, and then COVID happened. And so I was stuck in a room just going through old archaeological data sets and creating a data set. And I think the process of creating the data set was extremely valuable for me answering a bunch of, or posing new questions. I ended up having completely different thesis from before the database creation to the end. And I had to redo that database multiple times. Like you build it, and then you realize, oh wait, I want to add like another scholar's argument, and then you have to go through and check every single one in your data set and say, is this answering that person's question? So I think that the creation of the database was the most valuable part, because it allowed me, I was reading excavation reports from the late 19th century and realizing that there's way more arrowheads than I thought. One of the plaques, so far as I know, these have been published here. It's not on it's down there. But so the plaque on the right of the hoplite dragging the person, these have all been published. There's a whole series of them. This I think is probably a myth that we just don't know. They all are exactly the same. We have a ton of them, all from the island of Crete, particularly the eastern part of the island. People have published them. No one has ever talked about it. But like, this is probably a slave that's being dragged off. There's a sort of heroic story probably about this. The warrior is always wearing the same equipment. The enslaved person always has the exact same sort of leaning back thing. So the process of creating the database led me to discover a lot of really fascinating things that no one has been writing about. And I have not talked about this. I've not published this in any way. But like, when somebody asks me on the job market, what's your second book going to be? Well, it's like, well, I discovered a huge number of plaques that no one has ever published on, but I need to go do a whole other thing. So the creating of the database is now my go-to start to any project, because even if I don't end up using it, I'm going to discover a ton of stuff in the legacy data that no one has touched, because it was published. Like, one of these plaques was published in 1890, and another was published in 2016. So it's like, no one has actually connected those yet, and that's fascinating, right? So there's space there. So build a database is what I would say. You'll discover something really fascinating. It's going to take up way more of your life than you wished. It's valuable. Even if you don't use it, if you put it online, like, we're all just creating these massive data sets now, and somebody will probably find value in it.
But might be a big investment of time if you have a thesis.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm sorry. It's a problem. It's a problem for digital humanities. It's a problem for archaeology. Archaeologists are not publishing their PhDs right now because it takes them like 10 years to write a archaeology PhD, because they have to go through and collate thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence. It's a problem in the way that we do academia, unfortunately. But you can build the database, I think, and start asking a question. And if you have one question out of it, which you will, just looking at it. AI helps for GIS. It's really good at creating a GIS map for you out of your data set, thanks to Pleiades. So, sorry, not the right answer that you wanted, but but it's an answer.
Other questions? Oh, there.
There's a lot.
Yeah, can you? So
What
Sean is asking, what is the Crete hunt with big arrowheads?
Yeah. So goats is the answer that everyone always gives. They have a particular goat called the agrimi, which just means the wild ones. They have really cool long horns. This is the answer that everyone gives. I don't know enough about hunting arrows to say whether this is practical. The big arrowhead, in theory, is so that it makes a big enough punch in the animal that it can't run away, because if it runs away, you lose your meat. And so you want to create a mortal wound in the animal and have the arrow penetrate all the way through, versus interpersonal arrows, which they can just, you're using them to scare people and intimidate them so they can be really cheap and small. So the bigger arrowhead, the narrative is the bigger, heavier arrowheads are in order to bring down animals that are going to run away really fast. The agrimi is the perfect animal when it comes to Crete. And when I said that once to a room full of Cretans, they were all like, yep, that makes sense. Yep.
And there's another question.
Lamper at late Bronze Age Mediterranean Europe and also appears on Crete yet? Is there research on the Cypriot shields, the Cretan shields, and the late Bronze Age parallels? No. So Barry Malloy wrote a little bit about this, and he has an article, I think 2018, that I would recommend. And unfortunately, there's just not really been a lot on the Omphalos type. I really like the Omphalos type because we find the bosses all the time. And people just say, oh, it's the boss of an Omphalos type shield. And then they don't really go into any other conversation about it. One of the things that I think is going to change in this project that I sort of signal in the book is that once we go back and look at all the boxes of bronze from all of the excavations that have just all the unpublished material, I think we're going to find a lot of shields, because I think that this narrative that the Cretans don't have shields has really determined how people have been publishing the material. And when I went to Draros, there's just like 15 boxes of bronze plate, and some of it is helmets with clear mortal wounds and things like that, and none of it is published. So didn't make it into the book, but it's just the problem with archaeological publication.
There's another question online.
Yeah. So unfortunately, so the question is, you mentioned that the warriors donate their war booty to a temple. Would this have been a personal donation? Would the donor have been identified by name? So unfortunately, we're still unclear about exactly temple use in general and how this worked. The current idea is that these are spaces in which people are having regular feasting rituals in which there's also an altar, and they're making sacrifices at that altar. Is there a god involved? Are there multiple gods involved? We don't know. Donald Haggis, who did the best excavation of anything like this, is very firm in his belief that we should not use sort of Greek words to describe archaeological evidence. So we shouldn't think about the Andreion or things like this as being part of Cretan material culture use. And clearly what's going on in Azoria is different than what's going on just down the road. So it seems very variable. So typically we find arms and armor in what we call hearth temples that are very similar actually to like the old megarons in the way in which they are oriented and structured. They may just be feasting spaces in which people are putting up displays saying, like, look at the helmets that I captured, or their dedications to a temple. They're all published as temples because of the way that archaeologists publish things. There's a lot of figurines with women with upraised arms. So often they're published as temples of Hera or Demeter or Aphrodite, because if you find a female figurine, you assign a female god. I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. I'm not the guy who's going to change that whole narrative, but this is the way in which you'll find them in the publications.
Yeah, I love what you're doing this argument. Small query goes on this particular point about the described armor used. I recall vaguely reading somewhere, I think maybe the DPA group published based on our friend who was arguing that these are not dedication, because that they make sense in itself as armor put up in these kind of Andrei men's messes, where you only need to put the name on it because you have your friends or your rivals are sitting there right next to you. So this would be anyway, the significance of that potentially for your argument would be that then if they're not dedications, there's not this religious setting at all, and therefore maybe their meaning is just just fundamentally different. This is basically it's relevant, I think, to be interesting and important distinction between warriors and combatants.
Exactly.
Which I like very much. But if they are actual dedicated and the armor put up by people who've taken this armor for enemies in combat, then we are really talking about combatants who are also presenting themselves as warriors.
Yeah.
So in that case, the distinction.
Yeah, so I have some interesting thoughts on this that I express in one of my chapters. But essentially, so we take this idea that they are combatants and that they have won this through war building. What's so fascinating is that the Andreion space is an exclusive space. So the people that were involved in that, only the warriors are allowed to go into that space and put up the display. So whether or not they would have been visible, it's the threat of them being, you put it up in display in a space that's exclusive, but you're not involving or including or even acknowledging the other people you fought with. So there's this threat that you're going to sort of be exposed for claiming that you're the one who defeated that person, when in fact it was like a team effort. I mean, hoplite warfare is a team effort. So there's this really interesting thing going on between the sort of elite, what I refer to as the elites and non-elites, building on Gunnar Zelandtag's work and how he frames the Cretan underground space. And so there's like, they are saying, in the book, it's, I think, positive and negative interactions. So positively, they're saying we're all fighting together against each other. We're all elites who are the ones who are the warriors. And they're excluding all of the other combatants by having the space be exclusive. But in the battle scene, in the battle space, they're depending on those people. So they're building positive relationships with the other people. And their main goal of attack is the other aristocrats. Those are the ones that they're seizing war booty from. And so there's a very delicate balancing act between the elites working together with elites and the elites directly targeting other elites, and the elites helping out the combatants, and then the elites excluding the combatants. And this is creating a very interesting conflict that I think leads to Axos having a major stasis in the late 6th century. They have a whole bunch of laws talking about laborers. We don't know what kind of labor, but they open up the Andreon to the laborers. And then they say that any new war booty coming into the community has to be dedicated to Ida on the one hand for ex-urban stuff, and let's see, what's it, Poseidon in Axos. So it's an urban sanctuary in Axos. And so they regulate war booty coming into the community, and they open the Andreon in the same moment. And it looks like they're doing it for laborers, which, you know, seems like a bottom-up revolution or something like that that's happening. Anyway, I have lots of thoughts about that.
This is about the really striking statistic that
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering whether that you couldn't, rather than say it must be more, it must be a mistake, whether you couldn't sort of use that as support for your leisure class.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the injury rate is not just war injuries, but any kind of.
It's any injuries, yeah.
If you're ruling out all the work injuries.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, then the percentage is going to be lower than
Yeah.
work.
So I was on the fence on this for a while. I ended up deciding that I do think that there were a lot of wars on the island, and there was a lot of trauma on the island, and we're just missing it from the record. Because I think that this sort of robust warrior culture has to emerge out of actual violence and war. And there are lots of archaeological theorists who have taken a very strong stance on this idea that ritual warfare can exist, and I think ultimately I disagree with them, even though I have no evidence to back it up. But I just think that there has to be some sort of wars happening on this island. They're just not being preserved in the archaeological or historical record, fortunately. But I am much more comfortable imagining that the statistic is wrong and there is a lot of war rather than the opposite.
My question was going to be about that suspicious statistic.
Yeah.
Because it occurs to me that there's various ways in which that statistic could have been corrupted.
Yeah.
So there's the way it's being recorded, as you say, the way it's being preserved, just to do with archaeological practice.
Mhm.
Some sorts of things are collected and some are not. And there's something in antiquity that leads to certain things finding their way into the archaeological record, and some don't. This is not in any way a suggestion, but for example, people who die in warfare are more likely to be cremated. That would lead to you not finding those examples.
Yeah.
I don't think that's not a suggestion, as I say, but there's various different ways in which evidence gets corrupted, and it's something that might be quite interesting to sort of drill down into.
I think also
sorts of things we think might be.
we don't really take into consideration the material of the weapons. We're predominantly dealing with a really crappy iron or significant bronze. But the bronze is not, it's going to bend or break if it hits human bone. So, it may just be that we're not going to find skeletal records of war trauma. And the great example of that is I think it's Paros, I can't remember the place where they're all chained together in handcuffs. They're all mass burial. I just saw a talk like a year ago or 6 months ago and they're only finding about 11% levels of trauma. And like they literally found them chained together and buried together. So their skeletal records don't reflect war trauma. It may just be that the weapons of this world are not the kind of weapons that are going to break people's bones. They're going to do a lot of damage to their organs and stuff, right? And be scary and gross. And you get a cut and it gets infected and you're done. So, but it may just be that by looking at skeletal data, we're looking in the wrong place for war.
Very good on cutting throats and not decapitating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't want to have to reforge your blade. That's the whole, and then you got to cut a tree down, and yeah. Well, like the Griffin warrior. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Bronze Age swords are very fun and interesting, and I've written quite a bit about them. Yeah, I mean, if you hit anything with one of those early Bronze Age swords, it's going to bend and break immediately. So they're not really things that they're very performative in the way that they're being used.
I have another question of the digital side of your research. Because this is really an interdisciplinary research, so basically connected data from different perspectives. So how do you manage to bring them all together in your database?
So this is why I'm such a big stickler for my own bias. I had to take PhD exams in French, German, ancient Greek, and Latin. I did not do Italian, but there's a huge amount of Italian excavations on Crete. I learned Italian, but is my Italian good enough to page through the hundreds of publications that they've done? I don't know. I did it, and I created a database, and I'm just going to always say that my bias is there, and I'm waiting for you to challenge me. I mean, I think if you just try and be as thorough as possible, you'll do a better job than a lot of the older sort of paradigm generation folks who would take one or two examples and then build one narrative. I think that we can say in the 21st century, 2026, that methodology ultimately didn't work. There's no one sort of cultural way that things happened across the whole Mediterranean. I like to say I'm a professor of ancient Greek history. I study people in Sicily. I study people in Africa. For me, ancient Greek means the sort of Greek-speaking people of the ancient Mediterranean. It's not the modern state of Greece. So I think that we have to sort of just do our diligence and try and gather as much evidence as we can, and then look at what we've got and start asking questions and poking at it. I think that the age of picking one or two things and then saying, this is what I think is happening for the whole region, I think that age is done. I think that people are just constantly going to find too much to argue against for that, which means that you have to dedicate way more time than you probably should have for your PhD. Sorry.
Another question? There's one more.
The mercenary term is affected by Roman and, yes, nationalistic moralisms and hang-ups. The Greeks often use euphemisms like xenoi, and in practice, hiring was a political act between communities. Yes, absolutely. You could not recruit large numbers of soldiers without the local polis or confederacy approving. How does this affect your take on Cretans serving in foreign armies? So this is really, really important to my take. So Stephanie Craven in 2017, she's one of Paula Perlman's students at the University of Texas, Austin, wrote a dissertation called Cretan Mercenaries in the Hellenistic Period. And it's phenomenal. It's remarkable. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, all power to Stephanie. She decided to leave the field and find a stable job. So it's not going to get published anytime soon. But I had lots of meetings with her. We talked quite a bit. I think that she's totally right. It's the same thing that you're saying, Sean. They're not. There's a term misthophoroi. There's a term meaning mercenary. It's never used to describe Cretans. Even in the Hellenistic period, they always have some sort of negotiated alliance and then somebody comes in and pays a bunch of people to go fight. So it's not what we characterize as mercenary. It's something else. And I think that we're just using the wrong language to describe all these things. I think that, we talk about the Sicilian expedition as this episode where all these things, but we sort of overlook the fact that Thucydides tells us explicitly how much each of them are getting paid. Like he gives us a wage number for people involved. We're sort of overlooking that level of their own language. The thing I like to make my students do is read, the First Battle of Mantinea, where Thucydides tries to predict the length of the Spartan battle line. And he says, he doesn't know how big it is, but there's probably 32 people in a sworn group. And then there's 130 people in a 50-person group. And so I have the students always ask, how can there be 132 people in a 50-person group? these terms don't mean anything anymore, even by the time of Thucydides, right? Like, so you have to be really critical, I think, of all these different words. And I think when it comes to mercenaries, we just haven't yet. I think nobody has tried to do what Griffith has done with his book in 1935. Maybe it's time for someone to do a dissertation or a book on mercenaries in the ancient world. We often use the word condottieri to describe them. That also isn't right. That's a early modern term for Italian armies. So we need to use, I think, the words that they're using, like the same way that ancient historians say polis rather than city-state. I think we need to do that for mercenaries.
Any other question in the room? If not, I officially end the classical series of Digital Classicist 2026 in London, and thank you for watching live and for joining us in the room as well. And thank you to Jeff.
Yeah. Okay. Let's have a meeting, Sean.